It was the first time Steve had seen Claire confront Diana, and he couldn't tell who was more shocked when Diana ran out of the house. Over the next few weeks, the situation remained difficult. Claire constantly apologized for even considering this arrangement and for asking Steve to accept it. She was tied to tradition by her mother and did not think about the consequences. Steve was in a dilemma about going to the city for work. He couldn't put it off any longer, but the thought of leaving Claire on the island terrified him. Claire sensed his anxiety and insisted on going with him, taking time off from work. The gap with her mother grew even greater. They did not speak. And Claire never mentioned the tradition again. After much thought and worry, Steve decided that he needed to trust Claire and go on a journey alone. Claire again tried to convince Steve that she could come with him, but he knew that she was in the middle of working on a major marketing proposal and needed time to prepare. Claire promised daily calls and frequent contact. Steve went to London. Ferry, taxi, train, and subway meant that he was tired and collapsed on his hotel bed at 9 in the evening. He called Claire, who answered quickly, and they exchanged details of his trip and what had changed in the city during a long conversation. London was an endless stream of construction work. After the conversation, Steve immediately fell asleep, exhausted. He had had a few stressful days at work, but he felt refreshed. Being off the island had helped him clear his thoughts. He began to reflect on his relationship with Claire and mentally replay some of their conversations. The man who was so intent on trying to have a relationship with a younger man seemed as distant from the woman he married as he was from the caring mother of his children. He felt that Diana had too much influence over her and was glad they had a fight. She had gone too far, and he hoped it would end there. Still, he couldn't come to terms with Claire's actions and why she was so sure that this agreement would not affect their relationship, and these thoughts continued to bother him. Suddenly, remembering the trees that had been planted on his property the previous spring, Steve froze. Claire had been visiting the island regularly throughout the previous year. A feeling of horror came over him when he thought about who could have planted these trees. Perhaps she fought so hard for it this time because she needed to justify her previous actions. He called Claire, and she answered quickly again. Steve began. "Doesn't Jake Fraser have an older brother?" There was a pause before Claire responded casually. "Yes, I think there is." "You're just thinking, even though your families go back a long way?" There was a break. "Yes, Steve, he has a brother named Glenn." Steve continued. "He's about 19? More hesitation before she quietly whispered, "Yes." "And last year it was he who planted the trees?" There was no answer. Steve continued. "And what did Glenn Fraser get for this?" Claire recovered from her thoughts. "Only money, Steve. Their family is the only one on the island who does landscaping." "So you're not entertaining Jake Fraser right now as we speak?" Claire sighed. "No, Steve, I'm not entertaining, and you need to forget about this jealousy." Before she could say anything else, Steve hung up. Calls from Claire came repeatedly, but Steve ignored them all. He needed time to think. He finally answered the phone on Friday morning, surprising Claire. "Steve, thank God you answered. I was worried." "Indeed." That's all Steve answered. "Of course, I love you more than anything in the world. What time will you be back tomorrow? Should we talk about this?" Steve responded in a calm tone that worried Claire. "I won't come back. I'll stay here for a while." Claire panicked. "Please don't do this. We need to sort this out as soon as possible." Steve responded again in an eerily calm tone. "Oh, that's true. But you didn't rush to London to do it, and only called me during the day. I understand your evenings have remained somewhat busy. Please, Steve, come home. I didn't do anything. It's just your paranoia. Just come home and we can work things out." 5 days later, Steve was returning to the island by ferry. When he reached the house, Claire was already waiting for him with Diana. Apparently, the message had been conveyed to her. Claire tried to hug and kiss him, but Steve pulled her away from him. Claire began to sob, and Diana looked furious. "Why are you here, Diana? This only applies to me and Claire. Do I understand correctly that you never quarreled?" Before Diana could answer, Claire began to explain. We actually had a fight, but when you didn't come home, I needed someone, and you weren't here." Steve frowned. "It's hard to believe that my mother-in-law would make peace with someone if she didn't get her way. Given her efforts to reach an agreement, I doubt she would back down. I assume you never fought, and it was all a cover?" Claire's eyes widened. "This is getting out of control, Steve. I didn't do anything." Steve continued. "So you both agreed to lie and hide it because I wouldn't do it?" The argument continued, but went in circles. Steve was sure that Claire had cheated, but she denied everything. Eventually, he went into the spare room and left Claire and Diana alone. The next day, Steve decided to meet with his father-in-law, Bill Taylor, knowing that the conversation would not be easy. They always got along well, and Bill started with a friendly handshake, saying he'd been waiting for Steve. They talked about tradition and what Bill had learned. Bill realized that about 20 years ago, Diana had a one-night stand with John Fraser. He didn't like it, but it was like a night he'd thoroughly enjoyed when he was 18. Steve spent some time carefully laying out Diana's admission of a few week-long dates, asking if it was possible. Bill was upset, but said he always had an inkling that something else was going on, and his going on a commercial fishing trip provided ample opportunity. Steve asked Bill if he knew about his daughter's actions. Bill confirmed that Diana and Claire are inseparable, but tried to hide information from him. A week before Steve left for London, they said that the plan is already ready. Claire sat at the kitchen table, unable to look at Steve. "I can't believe that my dad is going to divorce my mom and that we are the reason for this." Diana made her own bed. "Your father would never agree to this level of deceit and lies." She still denies everything, although John Fraser admitted the truth, and he is not the only one. After a long silence, Claire whispered, "I know, and that's why I think I should tell you something." Steve didn't answer. "Sorry, Steve, but I made a deal with Jake. The explosion Claire expected never happened." "And last year with Glenn Fraser?" Claire nodded silently. Steve couldn't think of what to say. "Please, Steve, this shouldn't change us. We've had 22 fantastic years. How can you say that? This changes everything." "I'm so sorry, Steve. I thought I had to fulfill family obligations." Steve was seething with anger. "What nonsense! You just wanted to have sex with another man." "I did it and enjoyed it so much that I repeated it again." "It wasn't like that. It was a duty, an obligation." "So you didn't enjoy it?" Claire hesitated, knowing that she was on very dangerous ground. "Everything was ordinary, not like ours, just sex, not lovemaking. It was one time, it won't happen again. Only this wasn't a one-time thing, you did it twice. You had sex with both your brothers when they were barely 18, which makes you nothing more than a slut." Claire recoiled from Steve's verbal attack. "I'm not like that. I was supporting a tradition, part of educating young men on the road to manhood, that's all." They were very grateful. Claire realized she had made another mistake as soon as she said this. Steve shouted, "Oh, I bet they were damn grateful. You say it was one time, but how many times did you do this before you raised them? Tell me how many times. If I'm 18 years old, I'm damn eager to please, and I have a woman on hand for the evening and all night. It has to be at least 5 times a day, so maybe 35 once a week. It is unlikely to be just once." Claire couldn't deny it. Both Glenn and Jake were eager to please. There was very little training required, although some patience was required at the beginning of the week. She enjoyed their pumped-up and toned bodies. Just as her mother had predicted, the sex was exciting. She especially enjoyed teasing each of them with glimpses of stockings or cleavage, knowing that that night she would completely surrender to them. At one point, Jake even admitted that he was in love with her. It was the only time it occurred to her that a week could affect her normal life and the marriage she treasured. And she wasted no time in explaining to Jake the reality of what was happening. Steve's flow of speech continued. "And what exactly does an 18-year-old need these days? I bet they had their eye on you from day one and you couldn't get enough, could you?" Claire sobbed. "It's not like that. It was supposed to be a fun adventure." It was just sex. I know it hurts your ego, but still, I only want you, and you are the one who makes me complete." Steve got angry. "I would say it's more about trust and vows than ego. What about your wedding vows? Does tradition trump them? It's not ego when your life partner betrays you, and for what? Not for anything serious or serious consequences, but for the sake of traditional sex with some children." Claire blushed. "I understand that you are angry and upset with me, but you are strong enough for us to get through this. After Glenn, you didn't recognize anything, didn't notice anything, but we became closer. I thought it would be the same with Yaki. I didn't know because I trusted the woman I loved selflessly. Believe me, I will never do anything like that again." "Should I believe you?" "Believe it? You must be joking." Claire almost shouted back. "You can do it, I swear." "I'm really sorry that I hurt you. Think about the wonderful life we still have left. We can go back to the way things were." "Did you think about our wonderful life when you were planning all this and lying on your back?" "No, I would never have thought about this if I had known about the consequences. I would never intentionally hurt you. But I did it anyway. I know. And I'm really sorry." "And what do you think came of it?" Claire didn't know what to say. "Obviously, you don't understand how I feel. You tore out my heart and soul. How the hell can you fix this, Claire?" With that, Steve stormed off before he did something he would regret. He just kept walking, trying to clear his head, the beauty of the evening sunset doing little to improve his mood. When I turned back towards the village, I was surprised to meet Elder Helen Brown. Steve could barely return the greeting with a nod. Helen smiled and admitted that their meeting was not accidental. She saw Steve go out onto the path leading to the cliff and knew that she would be able to catch up with him when he returned. Helen offered to sit on a rock ledge and then cautiously asked Steve if he would tell him anything about his circumstances. Steve saw no reason for silence and told her everything. Saying it out loud did not lift the weight off his shoulders. Helen listened attentively without interrupting. He was hesitant to mention Diana's offer to have one of the elders have sex with him in exchange for Claire fulfilling her obligations, but decided that Helen had played a part in the whole saga and included it verbatim. When he finished, Helen was silent for a long time before she said, "Steve, I did not make such an offer. Diana never mentioned or discussed any agreements with me or Moira. This is not something we could consider. I can only think that Diana was trying to get you to admit or agree to sex with others outside of marriage to justify what they had planned." Steve was puzzled by her answer. Helen continued, "One more thing, Steve, these arrangements mostly disappeared decades ago, and even then it was only the first night, never a week. The only elements that lasted a week were housework or planting, with one night of union at the end. Maybe Melissa, Diana, and Susan acted according to circumstances." Steve just shook his head. Every time he began to come to terms with his wife's behavior, a new shock occurred. Helen continued by saying that she would speak with Moira and take the necessary steps to ensure that Diana was stripped of her elder status. As far as she knows, this has never happened before, and it will be a scandal. But Diana's actions are unforgivable. Nowadays, elders must engage in social activities and support the inhabitants of the island. Helen looked at Steve. "What are you going to do?" Steve shrugged. "I can't make her understand the consequences of her actions, but I would like her to feel what I feel now." They sat in silence for a while before Steve noticed a faint smile at the corner of Helen's mouth. "What is it that you are thinking about?" Helen's smile widened as she began. "What if you stay with me for a week? No joke. But we shouldn't tell Claire and Diana about this. We will say that I feel honored to accept the agreement that was offered on my behalf as an elder. So you give Claire a taste of her own medicine, and I get to torment Diana for dragging my name into all this nonsense." Steve was delighted at this prospect, but asked, "Won't this ruin your reputation? I'm still a married man, and everyone will think—" Helen interrupted him. "First of all, I don't care what people think. And secondly, I'm sorry to say this, but almost the entire island already knows about your situation, Steve." The thought of everyone knowing was another blow, but it was replaced by a pleasant thought that Steve shared with Helen. "No joke, but I would love to plant some trees for you. This will give Claire and Diana pause." They laughed together and quickly settled all the issues. Steve returned to his home and quickly packed his things. All he explained to Claire was that, on reflection, he had decided to accept her mother's kind offer regarding the elder of the island. And, under the circumstances, a week with another woman would be more than reasonable. He left Claire crying and begging him not to do it. His stay with Helen was surprisingly comfortable. She was great company and a wonderful cook. Steve spent time renovating the house and actually planted some trees in the backyard. They discussed Steve's situation. He hoped that this week would give Claire some insight into how he was feeling. Until he saw many other things that convinced him that Claire understood how wrong her actions were, there was no chance for them to reconcile. True to his word, he never slept with Helen, although they came very close a couple of times, and it was not due to a lack of desire. It was not long before Claire caught up with Helen at the village store and immediately began to reproach her for having an affair with her husband. Helen smiled sweetly. "Claire, dear, you, of all people, should know that this is not an affair. It is an agreement, and it will not affect your marriage." Claire heard an echo of her own words, but continued, "You can't do this. He's my husband. In fact, I am fulfilling the offer made by your own mother on my behalf." What was there? Me, Moira, or even your mom for a week? I think Steve made his choice, and I am obliged to honor the tradition. It could have been worse. He could have chosen Diana. I promise to return him safe and sound, although he may be a little exhausted. Claire gasped. You old slut." Helen answered calmly. "I would have thought that name would be more appropriate for one of us who had sex with two 18-year-old boys behind her faithful husband's back." With that, Helen stormed off, leaving Claire with her mouth open as everyone in the village shop stared at her. The next day, an enraged and hysterical Claire made a worthy attempt to kick down Helen's front door before Steve opened it. "Please, Steve, I'm so sorry. Come home. I'm just doing what you did. Why are you so upset? Because, like you said, this shouldn't concern us." "I had no idea. It's just cruel. It torments me. I can't stop thinking about you and that old woman." Steve replied, "Yes, it sounds familiar. Welcome to my world," and quickly slammed the door. Steve returned to his home the following week and was greeted by a much more reserved Claire. Claire began, "I can't believe you did this to me, but I can forgive you if you can. I understand how you feel about all this. That's just what you think. You have still only experienced part of it, not the deception and lies. Our entire time here is based on lies." Claire persisted. "We are still the same people, the same marriage. The same marriage that inspired you to jump into bed with other men, a marriage that you destroyed, and I still can't understand why you did it. Are you really that tired of me? It was never about you or boredom. If we can't go back, we can build something new. Let's look forward to all those retirement dreams, to the things we could have together. Travel, grandchildren, we can still do it all. We still love each other no matter what. It's not over yet, Steve. I will do anything to prove my love for you." Steve stayed in the house in the spare room, almost overcome with frightening thoughts about what the hell he would do with his life if he left Claire. He couldn't decide whether failure or abyss best described his prospects. It's easier to stay, and he still loves her. Given the consequences, he doubted Claire's actions would be repeated. The island was idyllic, and he had dreamed of traveling, spent years planning his options and sharing those dreams with Claire. Did he really want to give it all up? Claire wondered how it had all come to this. It was all so confusing. When her mother proposed an agreement, she rejected the offer, but Diana continued to pester her for several months. Then she saw Glenn Fraser at a dance. He was very handsome and delightfully respectful. She danced with him several times at social events, and they got along well. Deanna told her about her own arrangements and how exciting they were. She talked about it as a guilt-free romantic adventure and never viewed it as an affair. It was just tradition. Despite this, she knew Steve didn't think so, so she hid everything. If he never found out, it wouldn't hurt him. The week with Glenn was fantastic. During the day, he planted trees and spent the evenings in her bed. He was very nervous, but very charming, and so eager to please. By the end of the week, he had become a very competent lover, combining his size and physicality with great patience and technique. Claire excelled as a teacher. The week filled her with confidence. She felt that she had rediscovered her sexuality, which had faded during the long years of motherhood. Was it tradition or just illicit sex, as Steve suggested? She had to admit it was both. But didn't she deserve a little satisfaction after spending 22 years raising children and being a good wife? She was sure that it didn't hurt her relationship with Steve. Things had never been so good. She loved him more than ever. And after that week, they started making love more often. Jake was even more handsome, and she couldn't help but feel aroused at the thought of taking him to her bed. Steve was always smart and uncovered the tradition, and Aunt Melissa's memoirs be damned for giving it all away. Claire and her mother tried to convince Steve to agree, but he didn't go for it. Come to think of it, her decision to go behind his back was the worst she had ever made. However, she was confident that when the pain subsided, she would be able to bring Steve back. She just needed to remind him of how good they had it together and of their future aspirations. He will also want to stay together for the sake of their daughters and future grandchildren, and this angle could help her in her case. To Steve's surprise, their daughters arrived on the island 2 days later. Nicole wasted no time in criticizing Steve for his terrible behavior towards her mother, pointing out that the idea of living apart was simply ridiculous. Michelle seemed to be lying low, waiting for more information. Steve noticed a slight smile on Claire's face. Had he not noticed her manipulations and lies over the years? Apparently, she thought he wouldn't tell his daughters anything about their mother's actions, protecting them first, as always. All of Steve's doubts were cleared, but Claire was wrong, completely wrong. Steve raised his voice in a way his daughters could never remember. Your mother had been having affairs for 2 weeks with men, boys, younger than both of you, in fact. She doesn't seem to understand that I will never accept this behavior. Claire immediately denied this, saying that Steve had misunderstood the situation and that the men were simply doing landscaping work. Steve had to admit that she was good, almost convinced even him. Both girls knew that something was wrong, but what their father assumed was too far-fetched. Perhaps he was starting to go a little crazy. Steve might agree with that last thought, but he suggested they invite Grandpa Bill or the elders to help decide who was telling the truth. Claire fainted, or rather, she pretended to. It wasn't very convincing. All three just looked at her in bewilderment and waited for an equally poorly conceived recovery. Steve looked at her with contempt. I can never trust you again. It's all over. There's no turning back or forward with flashing lights. How you will feel when you look in the mirror and know that you betrayed me? Nothing can erase that. And how will I feel looking in the same mirror if I accept this? We need each other, Steve. We always depended on each other. It made each of us stronger. I'm right for you, and deep down, you still know it. Don't throw away your life to punish me. I can handle it, Claire, but I won't let you destroy me, and I'll build a new life. We all have to live with our decisions and be true to ourselves. You will have to live with the fact that you cheated, lied, and threw away what we had. I will live with the fact that I left the woman I love, but you are not the one I took you for, not the good and kind person with whom I fell in love. I would like to return her, but not you. Steve left the island with his daughters and decided to rent an apartment closer to their university. In turn, the girls were shocked by the behavior of their mother and grandmother. He never returned. His last act was to burn the trees in the orchard. Claire looked at the orange glow with tears in her eyes. Bill helped Steve sell the house because Claire did not have enough money to maintain it. The divorces of Diana and Claire became a scandal and predetermined the fate of the remnants of the tradition. Diana became the first to be removed from her position as an elder. Both she and Claire became outcasts, No woman trusted them or befriended them, but despite this, they resolutely continued to live on their island. A few months later, Helen Brown resigned as elder. Residents of the island noticed that she divided her time between being on and off the island. Eventually, she began to come only for a couple of weeks a year. When asked about this, she confirmed that she lives with her family, somewhere near a place called Durham. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. Listening to the next one.